This fellow deserves some kind of statue somewhere. There used to be a James Wadsworth uh, cafe at CSIS. I think their new building, they don't have anything for him. I hope I'm wrong, but I've never seen it. But I thought this man was really quite something. He was made uh, the key negotiator for the creation of the IEA. And he had read, and we'll see this momentarily, a number of the academic works, The World Without Arms Control in 1970, which talked about the problem of how a few weapons could be a big problem if they went off accidentally or intentionally, that they could catalytically draw major nations into small wars, that, just an accident alone could be misread. And therefore, we needed to worry about small quantities, not just 15,000 bombs worth being diverted. Uh, he called for the IEA to actually hold on to spent fuel. Can you imagine that it was a dangerous material because it contained the plutonium? That there shouldn't be reprocessing. There should be multinational centers, sort of like our friend Bowie, Mr. Bowie, pointed out. Uh, he was very tough-minded, and he was more or less instructed to back off because the Russians and Indians weren't about to agree to the IEA if those restrictions were kept in place. But he was a very clear-headed person who was willing to kind of stick his neck out and make different arguments about things when everyone else was arguing the opposite. Let's go to the next slide. What was assumed safe was the storage of fissile material. Eisenhower and Strauss, in particular, and I guess the AEC, came up with the idea that you could suspend enriched uranium or separated plutonium in enough solution that it would be so dilute you need a supertanker to get one critical bomb's worth. Well, we never did that, but at least they could conceive of that. And they said, well, that makes that safe. And any production activity or stockpile that didn't lend itself to getting to that numerical level of knocking out 100 American cities, depending on what your air defense capabilities were. That was considered safe. Okay. Now, they didn't articulate it that way quite, but that was in the background of their thinking. Go to the next slide, if you would. Well, this tells you just how late in the game and how senior thinking was still about knockout blows. He was asked, why the safeguards. There were a number of hearings held about this time. A little later, I think for sure. They were called the Hubert Humphrey Arms Control hearings. They helped create an agency that no longer exists, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. And they had a bunch of testimony about what would be considered safe, and would the inspections be proper? And they admitted, the experts at these hearings from the Atomic Energy Commission and elsewhere, well, they wouldn't be perfect. There might be there might be 1% of production that would go missing. Well, 1% of production, it's a lot of bombs worth. But then they said 10%. 10%. Ooh. Okay. Harold Stassen, who I think ran for president more than anyone else, also was made a UN ambassador. And in 57, he said, well, they don't need to be perfect, the safeguards. Even under the most effective controls, a government could divert, without the knowledge of inspectors, materials from which 20, 40, or even 50 multi-megaton bombs could be fabricated. But this was not a problem. Why? 100% perfection of inspection was unnecessary, nor would there be any terrible consequences because those few weapons would be deterred by the remaining capability of the hands of nations of various sizes. It also would not be enough to knock out 100 American cities. Now, that is not good enough for government work, I would say. Yeah. I would say that's letting the argument run away with you. They went that far that late in 1957. Next slide. Well, we know that this is nonsense. Why? We know that, in fact, you don't need a whole lot of weapons to knock out the target set that really matters, which is not 100 American cities, but the handful of SAC bases. There was a RAND analysis of this. This is, of course, Carswell, every Radu. You've seen this slide before. That said, well, you could probably knock out the SAC bases with somewhere between, I don't know, 50 and 150 weapons. Gee, that's a much lower number than what anyone's been talking about. Yikes. So they didn't get that quite right. They got the target set wrong, and they got the numbers wrong, and they were trying to prevent numbers that were much higher to protect targets that were not the primary targets. Okay. That you don't get the gentleman's C for that. You get an F. You get a failing grade. Next slide. Scores were needed. This is the bomber study, which my mentor was involved in, but was absorbed by the entire Air Force. This is not just a academic study. This shaped American Air Force and SAC policy, thankfully. They cared about their air bases. They understood this point. Okay, next slide. Well, I mean, just one weapon could ruin your afternoon. One of the things that you see here are a couple of things that could go wrong. For example, the Davy Crockett. I don't know what the rank is of that fellow, but it could be a corporal or lower. And if he's having a bad day, you don't want him experimenting with his angst, setting that thing off. That's a lot of delegation. These things were fielded throughout Europe. Also, there were a number of crashes with the F-104s and even the B-47s with nuclear weapons on board. There was a visit to the German base where the 104s were. You'll notice it has German insignia on it. They were loaded with bombs. They had bombs on the wings. And the only thing protecting someone from getting in the cockpit was a single Sentinel American with a rifle. That was it. This wigged out both sides of the aisle. They did not like that visit, and they complained about that. And then we had the Suez Crisis, in which Israel and Great Britain and France collaborated in taking back the Suez, exciting the humors of the Soviets, resulting in a threat to bring troops in, causing Eisenhower to have to threaten nuclear use. And the thought was, oh my God, a small war could catalyze a large war, could be a nuclear war. And then someone thought, well, what if Israel had a nuclear weapon itself? It could provoke one of the sides to come into the war. And the sides would have nuclear weapons in vastly larger numbers. If you want to know why we worry about Iran getting nuclear weapons, it isn't just that they might use them against Israel. It's that if they do, or Israel use them against Iran, other nations like Russia or the United States might get involved in a way that the war widens further. Bulb. They did not focus on how a few weapons could ruin an afternoon. They were too focused on these large numbers. Okay, next slide. We're almost done. This is what got me. I spent 5 years of my graduate school career reading and researching everything I could about the Atoms for Peace program, partly because I had studied constitutional law for almost as many years and in graduate school, and had been taught that Eisenhower was a political genius. And the reason that was so is, well, let's be candid, it was during a period when Nixon was very unpopular and was about to be impeached, and most academics thought he was a bad person and thought that if Eisenhower didn't get along with him, he must have been a genius. I say this as somebody who worked in the Nixon administration. I'm not a big fan of Nixon, by the way. But in any case, the idea that he was both a genius and he was behind the Atoms for Peace program raises a very interesting question. I read this book, Must the Bomb Spread, by a man who died before he should have. And he wrote, one of the most inexplicable political fantasies in history was Atoms for Peace. Only a social psychologist could hope to explain why the possessors of the most terrible weapons in history should have sought to spread the necessary industry to produce them in the belief that this could make the world safer. Now, what fascinated me was he a political genius because he was roughed up Nixon and he, soft-spokely, he was certainly a bright man, there's no question. Or did he engage in political fantasy? Let's go to the next slide.
That's the last slide.
Oh, well, the last slide should have been Oppenheimer saying, you know, the Atoms for Peace program's connection to nuclear disarmament was sentimental and elusive. And I have to say, all credit goes to Mr. Oppenheimer for that one. That makes sense. I mean, he nailed it. And I think Eisenhower gets low marks ultimately for this one. This was not his proudest moment. And why does that matter? Well, I think to a very great degree, we still believe in Atoms for Peace. There's a piece, Caitlin, maybe you can distribute it. One of the labs called me and said, we want you to do a critique of Atoms for Peace. And I said, oh my, I've done it so many times. Why don't we reverse the question? Instead of, why is Atoms for Peace so bad? I said, because, the problem with that argument is most people think it's good. I mean, when you go to Vienna, they have at the International Atomic Energy Agency an insignia, which is the Atoms for Peace insignia, and they say Atoms for Peace. I mean, they still do. And when you go to the NPT review conferences, you see Atoms for Peace. So, I mean, the idea that this was a terrible idea only goes so far. I mean, after all, it's still very popular. So I wrote an essay called The Curious Endurance of Atoms for Peace. You might find it interesting. Very short, very short. I'm not sure I know why it's endured, but I think we need to think about that because a lot of the things that it promised, it did not really deliver. Some of the things it did, but certainly not the disarmament. This disarmament section, it did not pan out. So you got a critical history. This one's a little negative, but pretty important because we still have that program in place and we still have those principles in place. And when we come to the next lecture, I will focus on the NPT, but first the IEA, which is a creature of the Atoms for Peace program. By the way, along the other connection to disarmament that Atoms for Peace has is what Eisenhower called the logical projection and follow through of the Atoms for Peace program. And that was the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, which we are still pushing today. That treaty was hatched, I believe, in 55. And the idea was we would get the Atoms for Peace fissile material eliminate the prospect of a knockout blow stockpile by agreeing not to make any weapons material any longer. And that in essence is what that treaty is about. The problem with the treaty is it doesn't prohibit making fissile material for peaceful purposes. So, how you can tell which atom is peaceful and which atom is military, not so easy to figure. All of this is a little on the scrambled side. If you get a problem wrong, you try to solve it. The solution could be almost as bad as the problem. It could aggravate it, or at best be irrelevant. And I think Atoms for Peace, by its own original objectives, can be criticized. Those objectives, I think, have broadened and changed. And as I say, it certainly still is a very popular idea. So there you go. Those are the first two really big nuclear arms control efforts, and we'll talk about the third one, which is NPT. I'm probably going to. We will have a session on arms control, which will go much further to discuss other arms control concepts. So don't feel like we're just going to stop at the NPT. But I think those three are important because they're the ones that try to do vertical and horizontal arms control. And there really are no others that do as much in that direction. I see a hand, Mr. Mayo.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I don't want to be contrarian because there's just been so many after effects of the Atoms for Peace policy and just our willingness to share that technology, the US specifically with certain unsavory actors that turned out to be problems later on. But I mean, doesn't part of this assessment that this is the most significant non-proliferation policy failure, doesn't that kind of privilege the seriousness of horizontal proliferation against vertical proliferation? And it's like it's difficult to compare the two.
I see.
And if under Eisenhower we built over 20 or 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, I forget what the chart
Yeah.
said during his administration, isn't that pretty much more significant, even if you just add up the total number of potential weapon states and however many India has? It seems like maybe it's difficult to compare these two outcomes.
Well, no. I think you're mixing an apple with an ocelot.
Sure.
Hey, let me explain. The mutual assured destruction, or I should say assured destruction policies of the Solarium project was never framed as an arms control concept. This was. So we're trying to stay on message here. Now, when we get to the arms control section, what I am going to argue is that the arms control ideas, and there were several others of the Eisenhower period, and as well as others, had a military objective. And the military objective here, you could argue, I mean, it was a little bit in the department of speculation, but I don't think it would be a stretch. It would be sympathetic to what you're saying. And what it would argue is that in order to have nuclear dominance, we promoted capping the other side's production. And it was to help us maintain a nuclear superiority that would enable us to forego having to build up all those conventional divisions in Europe. So I don't see. Does that help? I mean, I don't think you're being contrarian at all. It's a slightly you're right in a way that maybe you didn't imagine.
I see what you're saying. I just why say one is a non-proliferation policy and one isn't? It has a different purpose, but in the realm of non-proliferation, it's a much worse non-proliferation policy, in my opinion, to build 20,000.
Well, first of
Even
all,
if it has a good reason.
First of all, I'm more agnostic than you are about these things. I mean, I'll come back to the point. This was an arms control proposal. building up the arms was never sold as that. That was a defense policy. So I'm going to go back to that point every time. But I think in addition, I'll tackle what you're saying, just to be contrarian, as you say, which is good. By the way, it's not bad, it's good. We oversold what nuclear weapons probably could do. But I got to tell you, in more than a few cases, it's difficult to argue that it didn't, in fact, carry the day in a number of crises. People were afraid of us. We maybe should have been afraid of ourselves as well. But it's difficult to argue that nuclear deterrence doesn't advantage the party with more and better. And if that's the case, it's difficult to argue that some of the crises during the 50s weren't helped by us appearing to be in a dominant position because of these things. Now, having said that, the idea that you can, use this hammer and nail to solve problems in every case is ridiculous. I mean, Vietnam came, we didn't have Air Force bombers with conventional bomb racks, for Christ's sake. So we needed to kind of do a course correction, right? I think, however, to be even-handed a little, I think you'd have to say that nuclear deterrence and nuclear plenty and nuclear superiority did help. The problem is the inflexibility of the military capabilities was such that it also gave rise to crises where you were really without alternatives, which is not good. Does that help? I'm trying to take you seriously because I think what you said is a serious point. Right? Now, just because you're here and everyone else, I don't think we have anybody here still, do we? I mean, how many people are left? Oh, 10. There you go. Well, because you've raised your voice. I mean, the last point I'll make, which will come later in the course and comes from readings, if you want. I don't think we can play that card again. We did it in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I think condominium between China and Russia makes their hand heavier and stronger in that hand, if you will, of nuclear, then we will have a chance to play again. And we're going to have to find other points of leverage. That doesn't mean you get rid of the nuclear weapons, doesn't mean you don't, make them work or modernize them. It just means that the idea of doing a quantity game, no. That's over, Rover. That's fighting World War II again, or in this case, the Cold War again. And we're now in a new cool war where nuclear weapons will be there. But if you're really on your game, you hope they'll be in the background, not the foreground. All right. Okay. Fingers crossed. See you. When's the next Tuesday? Is Tuesday? What do we? And who's speaking on Tuesday?
Let me tell you. Speaking on Tuesday.
Thomas Grant, I believe.
Thomas Grant. Yep.
Okay. Well, we're going to be a little mixed up a bit. We're going to do your reading about the NPT, please. It'll help you with Mr. Grant. If you can just read what will take approximately 12 minutes to read is the NPT. In fact, Caitlin, let's put a notice out that the preparation for his talk should just be that. I think the rest of what he has articles I'm sure he wants us to read. Does he have an op-ed length characterization of his argument?
I will look into it. I'm not sure.
I should ask Anna.
Yeah.
He does? Well, but
I'll check.
the two of you figure out how to get the message out to the class. Read the NPT, which takes very, very long, and read his op-ed length thing. That'll be great. You are in for a treat. The NPT review conference is a for real forum. You will find people in the Trump and Harris camp talking about what we should do. If you listen to Mr. Grant, you'll get some idea of some other ideas of what we ought to be doing. And you'll certainly learn what the Chinese and Russians will be up to, which is worth knowing. Okay, that's it. Enjoy the holiday. I guess we're either Indigenous Day or Columbus Day, or both. Okay. All right, we're done. So how many people came at top of it? I think there was like 26, including the three of us, the 23.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. We're losing.
One second. I'm just gonna make sure the recording stops.
Yes. Yeah, you don't want that in there.
Um.
Do we need to take advantage of this?
Oh, I can. Yeah.